Hi, my name is Dorothy Cantrell, and today I'm going to talk to you about hormonal feedback loops in the non-gravid female reproductive system. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the hormonal control of the non-gravid, which is the non-pregnant female reproductive system, by means of different kinds of hormonal feedback loops. So let's begin with an overview of the general control pathway for hormonal control in the reproductive system. In both sexes, the brain controls reproduction through interaction between the hypothalamus and pituitary glands that influence gonadal hormones. The gonads also influence their own function by secreting hormones that feed back to act on the pituitary, as you will see in this presentation. So here's some of the important hormones we're going to discuss. First of all, the central nervous system acts on the hypothalamus, causing it to release GnRH. GnRH is gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and it's released from the hypothalamus down through the capillary port and into the anterior pituitary, where it stimulates follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, also known as FSH and LH. They're secreted and travel through the bloodstream, as you can see, to the endocrine cells and to the gonads, where they influence gamete production and steroid and peptide hormones. Now, these steroid and peptide hormones, which would be estrogen and progesterone, as well as members of the beta family, including inhibins and activins that act on FSH, as well as anti-Mullerian hormone, AMH, secreted by the ovaries to prevent multiple follicles from developing. These are all really important, and they have feedback loops. So they can feed back in their quantities to either increase or decrease stimulus to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, resulting in either more or less secretion of these steroids that affect the gonads and the reproductive cycle. Kind of interesting. And we'll see how these feedback loops work later on in this discussion. So in order to proceed, I thought it was important to define exactly what negative and positive feedback are. So most of the tropic hormones that we're looking at follow patterns of negative feedback. That's more common. Positive is less common. Gonadal hormones feedback to alter the secretion of GnRH, LH, and FSH in these long loop responses from the peripheral endocrine glands. And they come back and generally they inhibit the release of pituitary and hypothalamic hormones. Okay, so the definition of negative feedback is when a product or hormone feeds back to decrease its own production, inhibits its own production, prevents excessive amounts of hormonal release, and allows for proper control of the respiratory system. The reproductive system, goodness. When circulating levels of gonadal hormones are low, then the pituitary secretes FSH and LH. As the steroid hormone secretion increases, negative feedback usually inhibits additional gonadotropin release. And so as estrogen levels rise, interestingly, it can exert either negative or positive feedback. And you'll see why that's important soon. So if there's low estrogen levels in the bloodstream, generally that produces no feedback, and no feedback is the absence of negative feedback. So gonadotropin continues to be released. Moderate and high levels of estrogens would have a negative feedback response, and therefore they would shut down the release of these gonadotropins, LH and FSH. And that's generally what happens with elevated levels most of the time. But here's where it gets a little complicated. So if the levels of estrogen are elevated for about 36 hours or more, they can produce a positive feedback response. And this will cause stimulation of more gonadotropin hormones like LH to be released, which can cause more estrogen to be released from the ovaries. So it's kind of interesting. That's called positive feedback. Positive feedback is when a response reinforces the stimulus. Positive feedback loops stop usually when something external interferes with them to stop them, because otherwise they just are a continuous cycle. And the example that I came up with this was oxytocin release. So oxytocin causes a maternal uterus to contract when a woman is pregnant. And then the baby pushes against the cervix, causing it to stretch. The stretching of the cervix causes nerve impulses to be sent to the brain, which then stimulates the pituitary to release this oxytocin. Oxytocin then causes the uterus to contract, which causes the baby to push against the cervix. And you can see it's a loop. It's a continuous loop. What breaks this loop is birth. When the baby's born, there's no more stretching of the cervix. There's no more pushing with the uterus, and oxytocin is no longer secreted by the pituitary. So kind of interesting. So before we discuss how this works in the non-gravid female reproductive system, let's have a quick look at the anatomy of that system. So here's a quick overview of the female reproductive anatomy, and we're primarily concerned with internal female anatomy. So we're going to focus specifically on the fallopian tubes, the ovaries, the uterus, and somewhat on the vagina. So real quickly, here's the ovary, and the ovary consists of it's kind of a sac, and it contains lots of primordial follicles, primary follicles that are in the process of maturing and developing. And once they go from being a secondary follicle, it takes about 3 months to become a dominant tertiary follicle. And these are considered mature enough to be released under hormonal control. And when they are released, their follicle ruptures, the oocyte is released, and the follicle that was ruptured becomes the corpus luteum, which secretes hormones. And then this ovary tissue also can secrete hormones. Whereas once that oocyte is released from the ovary, I'll show you here, it will flow into the fallopian tubes, and these fimbria kind of sweep and kind of pull it in. And then by cilia and smooth muscle movements, it will move down the fallopian tube. If there is sperm in the fallopian tube, it could be fertilized, but we're talking about a non-gravid female. So in this case, the egg would flow down through the fallopian tube into the uterus, die, and be ejected along with the menses at that time. Let's see, and the ovaries are important because not only do they produce gametes, but they also produce hormones. Okay. Now, the female reproductive cycle is cyclic in nature, as we said. The first day of menstruation is considered day 1 in the cycle. Most gamete production cycles last about 28 days, and commonly they're called menstrual cycles because menstruation or menses is the most obvious part. It's a 3-day window of bloody discharge from the uterus, and it comes from the word menses, which comes from the word mouth. As I mentioned previously, the ovaries and uterus are major players in the female reproductive system, even when there is no pregnancy. Both organs are so important that the cycle is described in 2 ways with relation to each organ. And that would be the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. The system works in concert. Both cycles are under the control of the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and gonadal hormones, estrogen and progesterone, as well as inhibin and AMH. The ovarian cycle relates to changes that occur in the ovarian follicles, and the uterine cycle focuses on changes to the endometrial lining of the uterus. Each are divided into 3 phases. So, the ovarian follicular phase corresponds to the menses and part of the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle, which completes at the same time as ovulation. The luteal phase and secretory phases occur simultaneously and are closely related to development of the luteinizing of the corpus luteum. Okay. So the first phase of the ovarian cycle is the follicular phase, and it is dominated by the hormone estrogen. You can kind of see that here. AMH produced by the ovarian follicles prevents too many follicles from developing at the same time. This is a time of growth in the ovary of the follicles and can last from 10 to 21 days and is very variable. The phase corresponds with the uterine cycle, menses, as you can see here, and the first half of the proliferative phase. Okay, so this is all the follicular phase. You can see estrogen is important here. The menses is equivalent to menstrual bleeding from the uterus, and the first day is considered day 1, as we said, of their human reproductive cycle. Just before day 1, and we can see it over here, gonadotropin LH and FSH secretion from the anterior pituitary increases. FSH causes those tertiary follicles in the ovaries to start maturing. See, here's a tertiary follicle. The granulosa cells and thecal cells are influenced by FSH and LH, producing steroid hormones. The thecal cells make androgens that diffuse into the granulosa cells, where they are converted into estrogen by the enzyme aromatase. This increasing estrogen, and you can see here it's beginning to build and increase, it exerts negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. We kind of talked about that rising levels. So that GnRH, FSH, and LH stop being secreted and no more follicles mature at this time. But at the same time, that estrogen is stimulating those granulosa cells to produce even more estrogen, even though the FSH and LH are not involved. And so in this case, estrogen is exhibiting a negative feedback response, influencing the pituitary gland so that no FSH and LH are released. But at the same time, it is causing a positive feedback on the granulosa cells to secrete additional estrogen in the presence of estrogen from the thecal cells. Kind of interesting. The proliferative phase of the uterine cycle, which is right here, corresponds to the end of the ovarian follicular phase. And the endometrium is continually adding a new layer of cells here in case of a future pregnancy. And as the ovary ovulates during this phase as well. So you can see that the wall is kind of building up. It's getting thicker. The tissue is getting thicker in the uterus. The ovarian estrogen is still the dominant hormone and peaks just prior to ovulation. Okay, and you can kind of see that right here. This is ovulation. At this point, there's only one dominant follicle developing, and granulosa cells continue to secrete estrogen, beginning to secrete inhibin and progesterone. And you'll see why those are important briefly. Estrogen previously had exerted a negative feedback on GnRH, now switches to positive feedback. So there is a GnRH surge just prior to ovulation. The GnRH surge causes persistent high levels of estrogen, along with persistent high levels of estrogen, rising progesterone levels cause the pituitary receptors to respond really strongly to that GnRH, and you get a huge surge of LH, of luteinizing hormone. The luteinizing hormone is really important. It triggers chemical signals that cause the oocyte to mature and become a secondary oocyte, increasing in size in preparation to be released from the follicle. So now it's going to be a mature egg and released into the fallopian tube. The levels of estrogen are at peak just before ovulation, in preparation to receive a possibly fertilized egg, and the endometrium is about 3 to 4 millimeters thick. 16 to 20 hours after the LH surge, estrogen and inhibin peaks and ovulation occurs. Here we go. Okay. The mature follicle secretes prostaglandins and enzymes to allow the follicle wall to rupture and the egg to be released, where it's swept into the fallopian tube. This is where the unfertilized egg will die and will be released from the uterus via the vagina. This completes both the uterine proliferative phase and the ovarian ovulation phase. And at this point, the female's basal body temperature, which you can see down here, is at its lowest point, and this is considered mid-cycle. If the cycle is 28 days, we're at 14. The third phase of the ovarian cycle is the luteal phase, that's here, which matches the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. In the luteal phase, the ovary has released the ova. The ruptured follicle, which you can see here, is now the corpus luteum. It's a hormone-secreting structure. The corpus luteum has great influence on the uterine endometrial lining because of the hormones it secretes, mostly progesterone. And you can see that peaking here. Okay, it secretes increasing amounts of estrogen and progesterone and inhibin for the next 12 days. At the end of this time, the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans, and it will die through apoptosis, programmed cell death. In this phase, you can see that the estrogen levels are declining. They will never reach that peak until the next cycle right before ovulation. FSH and LH levels also decline and stabilize, and the female's basal body temperature rises, see right here, approximately 0.3 of a degree Celsius for the remaining 14 days of the cycle. This is due to the thermogenic effects of progesterone. Progesterone is the dominant hormone of the luteal phase. Initially, estrogen synthesis diminishes, but then increases to below peak levels. You can see the estrogen right here. Below peak levels, but it's still available, the combination of estrogen and progesterone exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, so GnRH, LH, and FSH are again inhibited. They're further inhibited by secretions from the corpus luteum of inhibin, they stay shut down through most of the luteal and secretory phase. Because of the corpus luteum secretion of progesterone, the endometrium continues to thicken. You can see it's thickening and growing. Becomes a secretory structure, growing additional blood vessels and depositing lipids and glycogen. And this would be in case of a possible pregnancy and embryo implantation. But in this case, there's no pregnancy, no fertilization, and no implantation. So the corpus luteum dies. There is no more secretion of estrogen and progesterone from the structure. And basically the surface level blood vessels die off, and it is sloughed off and secreted at the end of the cycle when the cells die, and this is when menses begins. And these are the sources that I used for my presentation, and I hope this was clear and enjoyable. Thank you.